Good evening. I am the Midnight Historian. Wherever you are listening from tonight, perhaps a quiet bedroom, a long drive, or a darkened room at the end of the day, you are welcome here. If you feel like it, you can say where you're listening from in the comments. And now, let us begin. There was a time when it seemed unthinkable that Rome could ever end. In the early centuries of the Western Roman Empire, the idea of permanence settled into daily life as naturally as the rising of the sun. Rome was not merely a city or even a state, it was a condition of the world. Roads ran straight and certain across mountains and plains, stone markers bearing Roman names and Roman numbers. Laws were written, copied and enforced with confidence. Coins passed from hand to hand, stamped with emperors whose faces promised continuity, order and control. To live under Rome was to live within something that felt finished, complete, perfected and enduring. People were born into Roman rule, grew old beneath it, and died assuming their children would do the same. The empire did not feel young or fragile. It felt ancient already, seasoned by centuries of victories and crises that had been absorbed and overcome. At its height, the Western Roman Empire stretched across lands that had once seemed unimaginably distant, from the misted hills of Britannia to the warm coasts of North Africa, from the Atlantic edge of Hispania to the forests along the Rhine. Roman authority reached outward in an unbroken chain. Garrisons stood watch along frontiers that were marked not just by walls and rivers, but by habit and expectation. Beyond them lay uncertainty. Within them lay Rome. Cities were the clearest expression of this confidence. In the western provinces, Roman towns followed familiar patterns. Straight streets, public baths, forums, basilicas and temples. Even where local customs survived, they were wrapped in Roman forms. Latin was spoken in courts and contracts. Roman law governed disputes. Roman tax collectors arrived on schedule, year after year, rarely questioned, rarely resisted openly. The empire's strength lay not only in legions and fortifications, but in routines. Grain shipments moved predictably, officials filed reports, governors rotated through provinces, bringing with them the authority of the distant emperor. The system did not rely on brilliance or inspiration. It relied on repetition, on habits reinforced over generations, and it was precisely this reliability that made Rome feel eternal. Yet beneath this surface of order, subtle changes were already at work. They were not alarming. They did not announce themselves dramatically. They arrived quietly, almost politely, and were absorbed into the daily life of the empire without protest. Rome's size, once its greatest triumph, slowly became a source of strain. Governing vast territories required layers of administration, clerks, magistrates, tax officials, inspectors, each adding complexity to a system that had once been simpler. Communication from the emperor to distant provinces took time. Decisions were delayed. Authority became diffused, passed from one office to another, often losing clarity along the way. Leadership, too, began to change in character. Earlier generations had remembered emperors who ruled for decades, whose names became attached to eras. But now, emperors came and went more quickly. Some were elevated by armies rather than by careful succession. Others ruled briefly before being replaced, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently. For people living far from Rome itself, the emperor's face on the coin might change several times within a lifetime. Still, daily life went on. Markets opened at dawn. Farmers planted crops. Soldiers drilled and patrolled. The empire did not feel as though it was weakening. It felt busy, active and alive. Economic pressures crept in slowly. The cost of maintaining armies along extended frontiers rose year by year. Forts required repair. Roads needed upkeep. Pay for soldiers had to be increased to keep them loyal in an increasingly competitive political climate. To meet these demands, taxes were raised, sometimes quietly, sometimes abruptly. In the countryside, small landowners began to feel the weight more heavily than before. Coinage, once a symbol of stability, became less reliable. Metals were diluted. Inflation followed, gradually enough that many scarcely noticed at first. Prices rose unevenly. Trust in currency softened, replaced in some areas by barter or local arrangements. These were not signs of collapse, only of adaptation, but they hinted at deeper imbalances. Civic responsibility, long a foundation of Roman life, also began to thin. In earlier centuries, serving as a local official had been a mark of honor, even pride. Over time it became a burden. Public offices came with obligations, tax collection quotas, maintenance of public buildings that were increasingly difficult to meet. Wealthy citizens sought ways to avoid these roles, retreating into private estates or securing exemptions. As the administrative class withdrew, the state responded by tightening control. Obligations were made hereditary, professions became fixed. Sons followed fathers, not out of tradition but requirement. Farmers were bound to the land, artisans to their trades. The system grew rigid, less flexible, less forgiving of disruption. And yet, Rome still functioned. The legions continued to march. Forts along the Rhine and Danube remained staffed. Treaties were signed with neighboring peoples, who were referred to collectively as barbarians. Not always enemies, sometimes allies, sometimes something in between. Trade crossed borders. Soldiers recruited from non-Roman backgrounds swore loyalty to Roman emperors and wore Roman armor. These interactions were not new. Rome had always absorbed outsiders. What changed was scale. Pressures beyond the frontiers intensified as populations shifted and migrated. Groups moved westward and southward, pushed by forces far beyond Rome's vision. Climate changes, rival peoples, internal movements. They did not arrive as a single wave, but as many overlapping currents. Rome responded as it always had, with negotiation, settlement, and controlled inclusion. Some groups were allowed to settle within imperial lands in exchange for military service or tribute. On paper, this strengthened the empire. In practice, it added new complexities to an already strained system. Still, there was no sense that the empire was nearing an end. To those living within it, these were challenges, not omens. Rome had faced crises before, civil wars, invasions, plagues, and survived them all. The memory of endurance was itself a source of confidence. Time passed. Generations grew up knowing only this version of Rome, more bureaucratic, more regulated, more cautious. The empire felt heavier, slower, but still immense. Its buildings stood, its laws were enforced, its name carried authority. And yet, something subtle had shifted. The sense of shared identity, once rooted in civic participation and mutual obligation, weakened. Loyalty increasingly flowed toward local leaders, military commanders, or landowners rather than distant imperial institutions. Rome remained the framework, but the emotional center had begun to fragment. In the western provinces especially, distance mattered. Decisions made in Italy arrived late, sometimes too late to be effective. Governors acted independently. Commanders negotiated on their own terms. The line between official policy and personal authority blurred. None of this felt dramatic. There were no great speeches announcing decline, no clear moment when the world tilted. Instead, there was a quiet accumulation of adjustments, compromises and workarounds. Rome adapted because it had always adapted. It changed because it believed change would preserve it. And for a long time, it was right. The Western Roman Empire did not fall suddenly. It aged, it stretched, it adjusted, it continued, confident, not because it was flawless, but because it had outlasted every threat it had ever known. As night settled over its cities and roads, lamps were lit in forums and homes. Soldiers kept watch along familiar borders. Clerks recorded taxes and decrees. Children learned Latin letters. Old men remembered past emperors and expected future ones. Rome still felt eternal, but time, patient and indifferent, had already begun to move past it. The sense of continuity endured even as the texture of Roman life slowly changed. In the western provinces, the empire's presence was still visible everywhere, but it no longer felt quite as solid as it once had. Roads remained, though some were less carefully maintained. Milestones stood where they always had, but the inscriptions grew weathered, their letters softened by time. Public buildings were still used, still repaired when necessary, yet repairs were often partial, practical rather than proud. The empire had entered a period in which survival mattered more than display. Political instability became a background rhythm rather than an emergency. Emperors rose and fell with increasing frequency, often elevated by military support rather than by careful planning or broad acceptance. To the people of the western cities, the emperor was increasingly an abstract figure. His name was known, his image stamped on coins, but his presence was distant. His authority filtered through layers of officials and commanders. When one emperor was replaced by another, life did not change much for most people. Taxes were still collected, courts still convened, the army still recruited and marched. Instability at the top had become normal, absorbed into the system like seasonal storms. Yet this normalization carried a cost. Each contested succession weakened the idea of a single, unquestioned authority. Armies learned that their support could make or break an emperor. Commanders learned that loyalty could be negotiated. Over time, allegiance shifted subtly away from the office of emperor and toward individuals who could offer immediate protection or reward. The state responded by expanding bureaucracy further, attempting to regulate and control what it no longer trusted to tradition or civic pride. Laws multiplied. Edicts were issued in careful detail, specifying obligations, penalties, and exemptions. The intention was stability. The result was complexity. For ordinary people, this complexity translated into constraint. Farmers found themselves increasingly bound to their land, their movements restricted by law. Urban professions became hereditary, locking families into roles that had once been choices. These measures ensured continuity of labor and tax revenue, but they also drained flexibility from society. The economy continued to function, though unevenly. Long-distance trade persisted, especially along established routes, but it grew more fragile. Disruptions, whether from conflict, administrative delay, or local unrest, had wider effects than before. Markets adapted by becoming more local. Wealth concentrated in fewer hands, often tied to land ownership rather than commerce. Large estates grew in prominence across the western countryside. Their owners, insulated by wealth and influence, became central figures in local life. They provided protection, employment, and sometimes justice, filling gaps left by distant imperial authority. This arrangement was informal at first, practical rather than ideological, but it marked a shift in how power was experienced. Cities, once the heartbeat of Roman civilization, began to change in character. Some shrank as populations moved toward rural estates. Others remained active but quieter, less ambitious. Public entertainments continued. Games, performances, festivals, but on a reduced scale. Funding was harder to secure. Enthusiasm waned. Still, the city walls stood. Baths were heated. Forums echoed with voices. Rome had not vanished. It had simply grown older. Along the frontiers, pressures increased steadily. The Rhine and Danube lines, long treated as stable boundaries, required constant attention. Groups beyond the borders were no longer small or easily contained. They arrived in larger numbers, driven by circumstances Rome only partially understood. Roman policy toward these groups remained consistent in principle. Manage, absorb, negotiate. Treaties were signed. Settlements were arranged. Entire communities were relocated within imperial territory, tasked with defending lands or supplying soldiers. These arrangements were meant to strengthen the empire by turning potential enemies into stakeholders. In some cases they worked. In others, they strained the system further. Settled groups retained their own leaders and customs, even as they served Roman interests. Their loyalty was often personal rather than institutional, tied to specific commanders or agreements. When those relationships broke down, tensions followed. The army itself reflected these changes. Recruitment increasingly drew from frontier regions and beyond. Soldiers spoke different languages, brought different traditions, and served for practical reasons rather than civic identity. Discipline was maintained, but cohesion required effort. Commanders played a growing role in holding units together. Despite these challenges, the Western Roman Empire still projected authority. When it acted decisively, it could still suppress revolts, repel invasions, and restore order. The problem was not weakness in any single moment, but exhaustion over time. Each crisis was met with solutions that solved the immediate problem while adding new burdens. Each adjustment narrowed the margin for error. The empire survived by using up its reserves, financial, social, and institutional, without replenishing them fully. To those living through it, this did not feel like decline. It felt like adaptation to a more demanding world. Generations passed who had never known the confident expansion of earlier centuries. Their Rome was defensive, careful, and reactive, yet it was still Rome. Children learned its laws, soldiers swore its oaths, officials enforced its rules. The idea of Rome remained powerful, even as the reality grew more fragmented. Local identities strengthened. A person was increasingly from a city, a region, and a state. Roman, yes, but Roman in a narrower, more personal way. The empire was still the framework of life, but it no longer commanded the same emotional center. Corruption, once an exception, became a tolerated inconvenience. Bribes smoothed processes. Offices were sought for protection rather than service. This was not universal, nor was it always blatant, but it eroded trust in the system's fairness. People complied because they had to, not because they believed in it. And yet, belief lingered. When trouble came, raids, shortages, unrest, people still looked to Rome for resolution. They appealed to governors, commanders, emperors. The habit of dependence remained long after the foundations had weakened. The Western Empire continued this way through the 4th and early 5th centuries, balancing pressures with experience. authority with improvisation. It endured because it had always endured. But the pace of events was slowly accelerating. Frontier conflicts grew harder to contain. Military responses were increasingly reactive. Resources stretched thinner with each campaign. The ability to recover from setbacks diminished, not suddenly, but perceptibly. Rome was still standing, still functioning, still recognizable, but it was no longer unshakable. And as the years slipped quietly onward, the empire moved closer to a time when survival itself would no longer be taken for granted. The 5th century arrived quietly, without fanfare, yet it carried a sense of change that was impossible to ignore. Rome, the city, and the empire continued to exist, but the familiar rhythm of stability now contained subtle cracks. People still walked the streets, still attended markets, still observed rituals that had endured for centuries, yet there was a difference in the air, a faint, almost imperceptible weight of caution and awareness that not everything could be assumed permanent. In Italy, life went on with an ordinary pace. Farmers tilled fields that had fed Rome for generations. Merchants sold goods in the city markets. Artisans shaped metal and clay, producing wares for homes and temples alike. Yet even as these activities continued, underlying pressures persisted. The grain supply from North Africa, once reliable and abundant, faced interruptions. Ships were delayed by storms, pirates, or mismanagement. Prices fluctuated more sharply, leaving ordinary citizens uncertain. Trade with distant provinces continued, but with more interruptions and greater local reliance. People adapted quietly, shifting habits, exchanging goods differently, learning to cope with subtle changes. Military pressures long managed by the empire grew more pressing. Along the Rhine and Danube, the presence of Roman legions was a steadying force, yet the frontier had become more complex. Various groups, Visigoths, Vandals, Franks, Burgundians, moved in unpredictable ways. Some sought settlement within imperial territory, others raided or tested boundaries. Rome responded with diplomacy, treaties, and relocation of communities into imperial lands. These measures often worked, yet they also introduced complications. Settled groups retained their leaders and customs, creating pockets of semi-autonomy within the empire. Their loyalty was practical rather than absolute, tied to agreements or personal relationships rather than enduring commitment to Rome. Political instability compounded these difficulties. Emperors rose and fell with increasing frequency, often installed or removed by military force rather than orderly succession. The office of emperor remained revered in theory, yet the practice of governance shifted toward commanders and local officials. Decisions were often made closer to the ground, at the expense of centralized authority. This decentralization allowed Rome to continue functioning, but it also diminished the cohesion that had once been its defining strength. Economic pressures were ever present. Taxes were collected more insistently, and their burden weighed unevenly across society. Rural landowners often struggled under the weight of obligations, while urban elites sometimes found ways to evade duties. Inflation persisted quietly, eroding the value of currency and pushing many into barter or local arrangements. Coinage remained, yet its reliability diminished, a subtle reflection of deeper systemic challenges. Social changes mirrored these administrative and economic shifts. Civic engagement, once a proud duty, became less common. Public offices were sought less for honor and more out of necessity. Families, constrained by law or circumstance, passed roles from one generation to the next, reducing flexibility. Local identity strengthened as imperial identity waned, creating a layered sense of belonging. City, estate, region, and empire, each with different weight. Despite these strains, Rome continued to function remarkably well. Roads were maintained, though unevenly. Administrative offices recorded taxes and disputes. Soldiers patrolled borders and garrisons. Cities, though quieter in some regions, remained inhabited and alive. Life retained a sense of routine, even as the underlying structures grew more fragile. By the time the Visigoths, displaced from their own lands by distant pressures, entered Roman territory, the Western Empire was no longer the invincible force of previous centuries. Negotiations and settlements were still tools of statecraft. Yet the empire's ability to respond with certainty had diminished. These interactions were not chaotic in the dramatic sense, but they revealed the narrowing margin for error. A problem once easily contained now required careful management, creativity, and occasionally compromise with outcomes less favorable than desired. The sack of Rome in 410, often remembered for its drama, was not the abrupt end that many imagined. The city's life continued, even after its walls were breached and its streets plundered. Administration persisted, ceremonies continued, markets reopened. Rome was shaken, certainly, but it was far from gone. Its survival after such events reflected resilience, yet also the slow erosion of the idea of permanence that had defined the city for so long. Across the western provinces, similar patterns emerged. Populations adapted quietly to shifting political and military realities. The empire's legal and bureaucratic framework remained, yet it operated with less certainty, more improvisation. Soldiers and commanders became more independent in decision-making. Local leaders assumed responsibilities previously managed from distant centres. Rome's presence was still tangible, yet it no longer carried the unassailable weight it once had. As generations passed, the Western Roman Empire aged in a way that resembled a slow, measured decline rather than sudden collapse. The machinery of governance continued, yet it did so with growing difficulty. The system was burdened by complexity, stretched by expectations, and constrained by the very adaptations that had allowed it to endure thus far. Daily life persisted, but the sense of invulnerability faded. People began to understand, in quiet ways, that the empire could falter, even if it had not yet done so entirely. And yet, amidst all these changes, Rome retained its character. Its roads, walls, buildings, and institutions still defined the landscape. Its soldiers, officials, and citizens continued to perform the routines that had long marked Roman life. The empire's identity remained a guiding presence, even as its actual control weakened. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire existed in a state of careful balance. Its authority persisted, yet it was increasingly mediated through compromise, negotiation, and localized power structures. It was not the Rome of unchallenged expansion and confidence, but it was still Rome, functioning and enduring in its own quiet, measured way. Even in these final generations, there remained a sense of continuity. Traditions continued, ceremonies continued, governance continued. Rome was still a framework for life, a reference point for civilization. Yet the awareness that this framework was no longer unshakable had begun to take root, subtly altering how people understood their place in the world. And so, the Western Roman Empire moved forward, not abruptly, not violently, but gradually, inexorably toward the centuries in which its survival would be increasingly uncertain, and its permanence would finally be questioned by those who lived within its ancient walls. By the later 5th century, the Western Roman Empire had become a patchwork of older structures and new realities. It still claimed authority over a vast territory, yet the experience of that authority differed sharply from one region to another. In Gaul, local leaders had taken on responsibilities once managed from Rome, maintaining order, administering justice, and raising troops. In Hispania, larger states had assumed a central role in economic and social life, providing stability in the absence of immediate imperial oversight. Even in Italy itself, far from the distant frontiers, the relationship between the central government and local communities had grown more transactional than idealized. The empire's military remained a defining element, but it had changed in character. Soldiers were increasingly recruited from diverse backgrounds, including former enemies, provincials, and even tribes settled within the empire. Their loyalty was often personal, tied to a commander or a contract, rather than purely to the emperor or to Rome itself. The legions could still march and fight effectively, yet cohesion required constant attention. Commanders had to navigate both military and political landscapes, mediating between the expectations of Rome and the realities of local conditions. Barbarian groups, long at the edges of the empire, now played a more integrated role within its structures. Some were settled as foederati, groups allowed to live within the empire in exchange for military service. Their presence altered the composition of towns and countryside alike. They introduced their own leaders, customs, and practices, blending with Roman systems in ways that were both stabilizing and potentially destabilizing. Rome adapted as it had for centuries, but these adaptations made governance more intricate and fragile. Economically, the empire continued to face pressures. Coinage remained in circulation, yet its value fluctuated more noticeably than before. Inflation persisted quietly, eroding confidence in currency. Long-distance trade continued, but it faced interruptions from both internal instability and external threats. Local economies became more prominent, as markets, artisans, and landowners supplied their communities directly. Wealth concentrated increasingly in landowning elites, whose estates became both centers of production and sources of local authority. Urban life persisted, though with changing character. Rome, the city itself, retained its monumental architecture, temples, forums, and baths. Markets still hummed with activity, yet the pace and scale had diminished in many areas. Public entertainment continued in the form of games and festivals, yet funding was often uncertain, and the grandeur of earlier centuries was harder to sustain. Across the western provinces, other cities mirrored this pattern, continuing to function, but with a quieter, more practical rhythm. Social structures shifted subtly as well. Civic engagement, once a mark of pride and responsibility, had waned. Offices were increasingly filled out of necessity rather than honor. Families passed obligations from one generation to the next, creating a sense of permanence in roles but reducing flexibility. Local loyalties strengthened, often taking precedence over distant imperial identity. Rome remained a reference, a framework, but the personal connection to it had diminished. The sense of gradual adaptation persisted, even as the empire faced crises. In 455, when the Vandals entered Rome, plundering the city, life continued afterwards in a quiet, practical manner. Administration resumed, markets reopened, people returned to their routines. Rome was shaken, yet it endured. These events were not the final acts of a sudden collapse, but rather episodes in a long sequence of adjustments and recoveries. Each crisis left its mark, eroding assumptions of permanence while demonstrating the empire's remarkable resilience. Religion, too, played a role in maintaining cohesion. Christianity, which had become increasingly central in public and private life, provided a sense of shared culture and morality that transcended the political fragmentation around it. Churches and bishops assumed functions once managed by secular authorities, mediating disputes, offering relief, and reinforcing social order. Faith became another thread in the fabric that held communities together as imperial authority softened. By the final decades of the Western Empire, the sense of everyday life remained orderly in many respects, yet it rested upon increasingly tenuous foundations. Authority, now distributed among local leaders, military commanders, and religious figures, required constant negotiation and compromise. The imperial center, while still recognized, exerted less direct influence over daily affairs. Rome's continued existence was as much a product of habit, tradition, and local management as it was of centralized power. It was a world in which continuity existed alongside fragility. Citizens could move through their days with routine confidence, yet a subtle understanding of uncertainty lingered. Rome was still Rome, its walls, its roads, its institutions, but it was no longer perceived as invincible. Its permanence, once taken for granted, had become a question, even if one rarely spoken aloud. In this final phase, life proceeded with quiet dignity. The empire functioned because it had adapted repeatedly, absorbing disruptions and shifting responsibilities outward. The legions marched, administrators recorded, and communities persevered. Rome remained a symbol, a framework, and a memory of centuries past, but its future was no longer self-evident. And so the Western Roman Empire entered its last years, not with a cataclysmic end, but with a slow, almost imperceptible fading. Its structures persisted, its identity lingered, its people continued their routines. Yet beneath this continuity, the certainty of Rome's eternity had diminished, leaving a society aware, however subtly, that even the greatest of empires might one day cease to dominate the world as it had for centuries. In these final years, Rome's presence was still visible in every province, yet it carried the marks of age and adaptation. The Western Empire, though reduced in effective power, remained a functioning entity. Roads, bridges, and aqueducts were still used, towns still convened markets, festivals, and legal assemblies. Soldiers patrolled the frontiers, sometimes in coordination with allied groups, sometimes independently, yet the legions themselves were no longer composed solely of Romans. Their ranks included many who were once considered outsiders, reflecting the practical necessities of the time. The idea of Roman citizenship, once exclusive and central to identity, had broadened to include many who had never known a Rome beyond its legal and symbolic form. In Gaul and Hispania, local authorities exercised increasing autonomy. The estates and cities had assumed much of the administrative work previously managed by distant governors. These leaders maintained order through custom, negotiation, and occasionally force. Their authority was practical, not ceremonial. They ensured daily life continued rather than inspiring loyalty to Rome itself. Yet the empire's presence was still felt in the expectation of tribute, the ceremonial recognition of the emperor, and the continued use of Roman law. The framework remained, even as its enforcement was increasingly uneven. Italy itself, the heart of the Western Empire, had changed subtly but irreversibly. Rome, still monumental and alive, had lost the unquestioned dominance it once possessed. The city's grand buildings, forums, and temples were maintained, but less as expressions of unassailable power, and more as centers of daily administration and habit. Public games and celebrations persisted, though their scale often reflected practical considerations rather than pride. Life continued with familiarity, yet the awareness of past grandeur and of the empire's fragility permeated the consciousness of those who observed the city and its routines. The settlement of barbarian groups within imperial borders continued to reshape society. Visigoths, Vandals, and other peoples were no longer merely outside threats. They had become participants in the empire's economy, military and social fabric. Some served as foederati, providing military service in exchange for land and recognition. Others lived as semi-autonomous communities under their own leaders. These arrangements strengthened the empire in some respects, providing manpower and stability, yet they also diluted the centralized authority that had once characterized Rome. Loyalty became conditional, based on personal bonds and negotiated agreements rather than automatic allegiance to the imperial center. Military and political realities increasingly intertwined. Commanders wielded influence not only on the battlefield but also in civic matters. Armies could elevate or depose emperors, negotiate settlements, and determine the fate of entire regions. Civil administration relied on the cooperation or at least acquiescence of military leaders. Imperial edicts remained, but enforcement required the support of those whose power was both regional and immediate. Rome persisted as a legal and symbolic authority, yet the execution of its will was distributed widely and unevenly. Economically, the empire's structures continued, though unevenly. Tax collection, once regular and predictable, faced disruption in times of local unrest or logistical challenge. Currency remained in circulation, yet its value had been eroded by repeated debasement and inflation. Trade persisted, especially along established networks, but the flow of goods could be intermittent. Local economies reliant on agriculture, craft production and regional markets became increasingly central. Wealth concentrated among landowners and city elites, who often assumed practical responsibilities in governance, defense and provision of public services. Social life reflected these cumulative changes. Civic engagement was less universal, more localized, and frequently motivated by necessity rather than pride. Offices passed from generation to generation, and families often managed obligations once enforced by law or custom. Local identity strengthened as imperial identity weakened, creating a layered sense of belonging. One could be from a city, a province, a cultural region, and an empire, each with different significance. Communities endured, yet the sense of shared, unbroken Roman purpose had softened. Even in this era of adaptation, crises continued to remind citizens of the empire's limitations. Raids, internal rebellions, and competing claims to authority tested the system repeatedly. Each challenge was met with a mixture of improvisation, negotiation, and enforcement. Rome survived not because it was invincible, but because it had become adept at absorbing shocks, often using them to reinforce the existing order in modified form. Resilience became a hallmark, as did pragmatism. By the very end of the Western Empire, the idea of Rome remained powerful, yet it was largely symbolic. The emperor was still recognized, the legions still wore their insignia, and Roman law still governed many aspects of life. The city of Rome itself stood as a testament to centuries of history. But the structures that had once guaranteed permanence, the centralized authority, the unquestioned loyalty of the provinces, the certainty of economic stability had weakened. Control existed, yet it was mediated through a network of local powers, military leaders, and settled barbarian communities. Life continued, as it always had. Roads were traveled, markets operated, soldiers drilled, and officials recorded. Rome's presence was everywhere, yet it was no longer absolute. People lived within its framework, observed its laws, and respected its authority, but the sense of invulnerability had passed. The Western Roman Empire persisted as a functioning entity, yet its endurance relied increasingly on adaptation, negotiation, and practical management, rather than the unquestioned supremacy that had defined earlier centuries. In this quiet, measured way, the empire approached its final days. It did not vanish in a moment of catastrophe. It lingered, performing its rituals, maintaining its institutions, and holding together a fragile network of authority and tradition. And yet, for the first time in centuries, those within its boundaries could sense, if only subtly, that the eternal Rome they had always known might not be eternal after all. The final years of the Western Roman Empire were marked by a tension between endurance and fragility. Inhabitants of the empire went about their lives with familiar routines. Farmers worked their fields, merchants sold their wares, and soldiers maintained patrols along frontiers. Rome itself, the city and symbol of imperial authority, continued to stand with its monumental architecture and bustling streets. Yet beneath this enduring surface, the structures that had once guaranteed stability were increasingly strained. The emperor remained a figurehead of central authority, but his influence was often more symbolic than practical. Decisions from Rome took time to reach distant provinces, and local leaders, whether city magistrates, landowners, or military commanders, held much of the real power. Their authority was exercised quietly through negotiation, obligation, and management of practical affairs, rather than through grand decrees. In this way the empire functioned, but with an underlying dependence on human networks rather than institutional strength. Settled barbarian groups continued to influence both military and civil life. These communities, integrated as foederati or allowed to inhabit imperial lands in exchange for service, became permanent fixtures. Their leaders were recognized in official matters, and their soldiers bolstered Roman forces. This integration provided stability, yet it also diluted centralized control. The empire relied on these groups to maintain order, and their loyalty, while often dependable, was conditional and personal rather than absolute. Economic life persisted under these conditions, though with growing irregularities. Tax collection, once methodical and predictable, required flexibility and local enforcement. Inflation affected coinage gradually, and long-distance trade experienced disruptions, making local markets increasingly vital. Wealth concentrated among landowners and city elites, who often took on responsibilities once performed by the imperial administration. Estates and urban centers became self-sustaining in ways that diminished the immediate presence of central authority, yet the broader framework of Rome remained influential. Urban life adapted to these realities. Cities continued to host public entertainments, forums, and religious ceremonies. Temples, baths, and markets remained operational, yet their scale and frequency often reflected practical necessity rather than the pride of earlier centuries. Civic participation continued, but it was more localized and often compelled by obligation rather than embraced as a source of honor or identity. Social cohesion relied increasingly on community structures, local leaders, and religious institutions. Christianity, now deeply embedded in Western society, provided an additional layer of continuity. Bishops and church officials assumed responsibilities that had once been managed by secular authorities, mediating disputes, offering relief, and reinforcing social order. Faith, intertwined with governance and community life, helped to maintain cohesion in an era when traditional political structures were under stress. The moral and cultural authority of the church became a stabilizing force even as imperial power waned. Military and political pressures persisted. Frontiers remained manned, but armies had become more decentralized, composed of diverse recruits with varying degrees of loyalty. Commanders held significant authority in their own right, capable of shaping local outcomes, elevating or deposing emperors, and negotiating settlements with neighboring peoples. The empire's survival depended on a delicate balance of local initiative and nominal imperial direction. By the mid to late 5th century, Rome's influence extended across a landscape that was both recognizable and altered. Its cities, roads, and laws remained, yet their maintenance depended on continuous adaptation. Authority existed, but it was increasingly mediated through a web of relationships and agreements. The empire's endurance was practical rather than assured, reliant on negotiation, compromise, and human effort. When Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor in 476, it did not produce an immediate rupture of daily life. Administration continued, local elites maintained order, and the habits of Roman governance persisted in adapted forms. The empire's disappearance as a centralized authority was gradual, a quiet reorganization of power rather than a sudden end. Rome itself remained a city, inhabited and functioning, even as its political significance shifted. In these final decades, the Western Roman Empire exemplified a slow, measured decline. Its structures, culture, and identity persisted, yet the sense of permanence that had defined earlier centuries had faded. Citizens lived within a familiar framework, observing laws, paying taxes, and participating in community life. Yet they did so with the subtle awareness that the unshakable empire they had known was no longer absolute. Thus, the story of Rome's decline is not one of dramatic collapse, but of endurance tempered by fragility, of adaptation entwined with gradual erosion. It is a story of centuries quietly slipping by, of traditions maintained even as their foundations weakened, and of an empire that, in its final generations, still existed, still functioned, but no longer felt eternal. By the time the Western Roman Empire ceased to function as a centralized political authority, its people had long been accustomed to managing life with a mixture of imperial guidance and local initiative. In towns and countryside alike, continuity was maintained through layers of habit, negotiation, and pragmatic adaptation. Roads were traveled, markets continued to operate, and soldiers still patrolled borders, yet the certainty of imperial oversight had diminished. Communities learned to rely on local leaders, estate owners, and military commanders to resolve disputes and enforce order. Rome's laws remained, but their application depended on intermediaries rather than direct control from the emperor. The shift in loyalty and authority was subtle but pervasive. Soldiers who once swore allegiance solely to the emperor now recognized the command of local generals and leaders. Settled barbarian groups, integrated into imperial structures, maintained their own traditions and hierarchies, negotiating their obligations to Rome. Landowners administered justice and collected dues, filling gaps left by an increasingly distant central administration. The empire persisted in form, but its function had become decentralized. Economic life, too, reflected this transition. Trade continued, particularly along established routes, but it became increasingly reliant on regional networks and local resources. Currency circulated, though inflation and occasional debasement affected confidence. Taxation, once predictable and uniform, varied widely by region, with local officials adjusting collection to meet immediate needs. Estates and urban centers provided much of the practical administration, their influence extending well beyond the purely economic sphere. Wealth and authority were often inseparable, concentrated in those capable of sustaining communities in uncertain times. Religion played an increasingly central role in maintaining social cohesion. Christian bishops and clergy assumed responsibilities that had formerly belonged to civic officials, mediating disputes, providing relief, and offering moral guidance. Churches became centers of community life, reinforcing cultural continuity, even as political structures weakened. The moral and social authority of the church became a stabilizing force in an age when secular authority had grown fragile. Through these adaptations, the Western Empire continued to exist in recognizable form, even as the sense of permanence faded. Roman identity persisted, but it had become layered and flexible. People were Romans, certainly, but also citizens of cities, subjects of regional leaders, and participants in local networks of influence. The emperor's name remained on coins, his image stamped across the empire, yet the practical realities of governance were mediated through intermediaries, agreements, and personal loyalties. The final decades of the Western Empire were quiet in many ways. There were no sweeping battles or cataclysms that eradicated the structures of Roman life. Instead, decline was measured, gradual, and almost imperceptible to those living through it. Military, administrative, economic, and social functions continued, albeit with increasing reliance on local initiative and adaptation. Crises were absorbed and managed, often leaving the daily routines of citizens largely intact. Even when the last emperor was deposed, Rome as a city and a symbol endured. Its streets were still travelled, its markets still opened, and its institutions continued to function in adapted forms. The disappearance of centralized imperial authority did not equate to the disappearance of Roman culture, law, or daily life. The structures that had underpinned centuries of civilization persisted through the efforts of communities, local leaders, and integrated groups, maintaining a sense of order and continuity. In this sense, the Western Roman Empire did not end in a single moment. It faded gradually, through decades of adaptation, compromise, and subtle change. Its story is one of endurance in the face of erosion, of continuity maintained even as foundations weakened. Citizens lived their lives, aware perhaps only faintly that the unshakable empire of their forebears had quietly transformed. Rome in its final generations still existed, still functioned, and still left an indelible mark upon the world it had shaped for centuries. Thus concludes the long, gentle story of the Western Roman Empire's final centuries, a tale not of abrupt collapse, but of quiet transition, slow adaptation, and the subtle awareness that even the greatest of empires may one day cease to be. After the last emperor in the West was deposed, daily life did not collapse. Rome, though no longer the seat of a unified imperial authority, remained a city of inhabitants, merchants, and administrators. The monuments, temples, and forums still commanded attention, not as symbols of power, but as reminders of centuries past. Citizens and local leaders continued to navigate the familiar streets, carrying on their routines, maintaining markets, and overseeing civic matters. The change was not dramatic. It was a shift in perception, a realization that authority had become localized and conditional rather than absolute. In Italy, power was increasingly exercised by local magnates, former military commanders, and influential families. They inherited both the responsibilities and the privileges that once belonged to distant emperors. Estates grew in prominence, serving as centers of administration, economic production, and defense. These landowners often acted as intermediaries between communities and the outside world, providing protection, adjudicating disputes, and distributing resources. Rome itself, while symbolically important, had become one node among many, rather than the singular heart of the West. Elsewhere, the former provinces adapted similarly. Gaul, Hispania, and North Africa were shaped by a mixture of Roman legal structures, local traditions, and the influence of settled barbarian groups. Visigoths, Burgundians, Vandals, and others had established footholds within imperial territory, some as allies, others as autonomous powers. They adopted certain Roman customs and laws, yet they retained their own governance, language, and military traditions. In many regions, the blending of Roman and non-Roman practices created a hybrid culture, part continuity, part transformation. Trade and economy persisted, though in altered forms. Long-distance commerce continued along established routes, linking Mediterranean ports, river valleys, and northern settlements. Yet local markets became increasingly central to daily life. Coinage circulated unevenly, often supplemented by barter or locally minted tokens. Wealth concentrated in estates and urban elites, who managed resources and labor with a practicality that had once been handled by centralized imperial bureaucracy. Even in these changes, however, Roman habits of accounting, contracts, and law lingered, providing a framework for order amid transformation. Religion, particularly Christianity, became an enduring stabilizing force. Bishops and clergy not only guided spiritual life, but increasingly assumed civic roles, mediating disputes, distributing charity, and organizing local administration. Churches served as meeting places, repositories of knowledge, and centers of learning. Christian morality and ritual offered continuity even as political authority fractured, helping communities maintain cohesion in uncertain times. In many ways, the Church preserved what the Western Empire had struggled to maintain, linking the past to an evolving present. The population's understanding of Roman identity also transformed. People were still Roman in law and culture, yet their immediate loyalties were local, to city, village, or estate, to a regional leader or military commander, to the Church. Memory of the imperial past shaped their customs, architecture, and legal systems, but the empire itself existed more as an inherited framework than as a lived, omnipresent authority. The idea of Rome outlasted the reality of its centralized rule. Military power, long a defining feature of the empire, became more fragmented. Armies were smaller, often raised regionally or maintained by local rulers rather than centrally. Many former imperial soldiers served under barbarian leaders or local magnates, yet they retained training, discipline, and Roman methods. Fortifications and border posts remained, but they were now managed by regional authorities, sometimes cooperatively, sometimes competitively. Conflict persisted, but the scale and organization of warfare reflected local imperatives rather than imperial strategy. In the centuries that followed, the cultural and administrative legacy of Rome remained influential across the former Western Empire. Legal systems retained Roman forms and procedures, architecture continued to follow Roman patterns, and Latin persisted as a language of literacy, law, and scholarship. Education, though less formalized in some regions, still relied on Roman texts and methods. Cities continued to function as centers of culture and administration, even under new rulers. In these ways, the Western Roman Empire, though politically gone, endured in habits, memory, and structure. Life, in essence, became a careful balance between continuity and adaptation. Communities navigated local realities while maintaining the trappings of a civilization whose centralized authority had passed. Rome's roads, aqueducts, walls, and buildings continued to serve their practical purposes. Markets, forums, and legal procedures persisted, enabling ordinary citizens to live structured, familiar lives. Settled barbarian groups and emerging regional powers reshaped the social and political landscape, but they also preserved many Roman practices, sometimes inadvertently, sometimes deliberately. Through this slow transformation, the Western Empire's influence remained palpable. It was no longer a unified state, yet its forms, habits, and values shaped the trajectory of Western Europe for centuries to come. Life carried on quietly, punctuated by adaptations and innovations, yet grounded in centuries of inherited Roman order. The empire, in its final generations, had taught its people how to survive, even when central authority faltered, leaving a legacy that would outlast its political existence by many generations. Rome, though no longer ruling as it once had, persisted as a cultural, legal, and spiritual reference. Its citizens and former subjects carried its imprint in their laws, their customs, their towns, and their very understanding of civilization. In this way, the empire's story did not end abruptly. It continued gently, quietly, as life adapted to new circumstances, while remembering the old structures, the old rhythms, and the enduring memory of a civilization that had once spanned the Western world. In the years following the deposition of the last emperor, the territories of the former Western Empire settled into a rhythm both familiar and altered. Italy, Gaul, Hispania, and the provinces of North Africa and Britain, where the Romans had once exercised direct control, were now governed in a patchwork of arrangements. Local rulers, often former military commanders or landowners, assumed the responsibilities that had once belonged to Rome itself. They collected taxes, adjudicated disputes, and maintained local defenses. Their authority was practical and immediate, rather than abstract or ceremonial. People continued their daily lives with a sense of order, yet the framework that had long seemed permanent had transformed into something more flexible, more responsive to local conditions. In Italy, the city of Rome itself persisted as a hub of life and administration. Though its political importance had diminished, the ancient roads still carried travelers, merchants and soldiers, connecting towns and estates across the peninsula. Temples and public buildings, while no longer maintained with imperial resources, continued to serve practical and ceremonial purposes. Markets remained active, supplying residents with goods from near and far. The city's inhabitants adapted to new rulers and realities, yet the rhythms of daily life, commerce, social interaction, religious observance remained recognizable to anyone who had walked Rome's streets in earlier generations. Settled barbarian communities became increasingly integrated into these territories. The Visigoths in Gaul and Hispania, the Vandals in North Africa, and various smaller groups established themselves as political and military presences. Some adopted Roman customs, language and law to facilitate governance and commerce. Others retained distinct identities, blending them with Roman practices in ways that created hybrid cultures. These groups were no longer simply barbarians at the gates. They had become stakeholders, partners and sometimes rulers, shaping the social and political fabric of the lands they inhabited. Economically, continuity coexisted with change. Trade continued along established routes, linking Mediterranean ports, river valleys, and northern settlements. Yet disruptions were frequent, and local economies grew in importance. Estates, cities, and regional networks supplied the needs of communities when long-distance commerce faltered. Currency remained in circulation, though its value fluctuated and barter persisted in some regions. Wealth concentrated increasingly among landowners and city elites, whose management of labor, resources, and security often replaced the functions formerly handled by centralized imperial administration. Socially, life remained structured but increasingly localized. Civic offices, once aspirational positions of honor, were often inherited or assumed for practical reasons. Communities relied on local leaders and the church to mediate disputes, provide charity, and organize defense. Roman law continued to inform legal proceedings, though its enforcement depended on regional authorities rather than distant emperors. Religious institutions, particularly the Christian Church, provided stability, continuity, and moral guidance, helping to preserve social cohesion amid political fragmentation. The memory of Rome, meanwhile, remained a powerful influence. Even in regions governed by new powers, Roman customs, architecture, and administrative practices endured. Roads, aqueducts, walls, and public buildings continued to serve practical purposes. Schools and monasteries preserved literacy, Latin language, and Roman texts. Legal codes and civic rituals shaped everyday life. The empire's structures, though no longer centralized, continued to guide behavior and thought. Military life, too, adapted. Armies were smaller and more regionalized, often maintained by local rulers or integrated barbarian groups. Soldiers retained Roman training, tactics, and discipline, but their loyalty was directed more toward immediate commanders than toward a distant emperor. Fortifications and garrisons continued to serve defensive purposes, but local initiative determined their upkeep and strategic use. Conflicts occurred, but they were typically localized or negotiated rather than undertaken as part of coordinated imperial campaigns. Through all these changes, life maintained a continuity that might have seemed remarkable to anyone reflecting on the centuries of Roman history. The structures of empire persisted in altered form, integrated with new authorities, hybrid cultures, and adapted practices. Citizens lived within familiar frameworks, yet their understanding of Rome had shifted. It was a reference, a cultural memory, and a set of practical tools for governance and social order, rather than an omnipotent, unchallenged power. Across these centuries, the Western territories became a landscape of subtle transformation. The centralized Western Roman Empire had ceased to exist as a political entity, yet its legacy shaped the emerging societies. Its roads connected communities, its laws guided behavior, its architecture framed towns and cities, its cultural and religious institutions influenced identity, morality, and social cohesion. Rome, in memory and in practice, persisted, not as a government, but as a civilization whose influence endured quietly, through the lives of ordinary people, the work of local authorities, and the guidance of the Church. In this way, the story of the Western Empire extended beyond its formal political existence. Its end was not a sudden rupture, but a slow, measured transition. Life continued, shaped by inherited structures and adapted to new realities. The empire's memory informed governance, law, culture, and daily life. Its roads carried travelers and traders, its cities hosted markets and festivals, its institutions, religious and civic, maintained continuity even amid change. The Western Roman Empire, in essence, lived on, not as a singular power, but as a pervasive and enduring influence on the lands and people it had once governed. In the century following the formal end of imperial rule in the West, the territories of the former Western Roman Empire gradually coalesced into new patterns of governance. In Gaul, the Visigoths established a kingdom centered in Toulouse, blending Roman administrative practices with their own traditions. Cities retained their Roman layouts, forums, and baths, though local elites and the church increasingly assumed responsibilities for law, justice, and civic order. Markets continued to operate, supplying goods both local and imported, while roads that had once linked the empire remained vital for trade and communication, even if maintenance was now less consistent. Hispania, too, experienced the integration of Roman and barbarian influences. The Visigoths, after migrating from Gaul, ruled over both Roman citizens and their own people. They adopted Roman law, preserved cities, and allowed municipal governments to function with a degree of continuity. At the same time, the settlement of new populations introduced different customs and power dynamics, creating a hybrid culture where Roman identity persisted in daily life, even under foreign rulers. In North Africa, the Vandals maintained control for decades, yet Roman towns continued to function. Cities such as Carthage remained centers of trade, administration, and culture, drawing on the networks and infrastructure established over centuries. Roman civic life adapted to new rulers, preserving essential functions while accommodating the realities of a transformed political landscape. Local officials, landowners, and church leaders played increasingly prominent roles, ensuring that commerce, law, and social order continued uninterrupted. Italy, the heart of the former empire, saw particularly complex developments. Rome itself remained a living city, its monuments and institutions preserved by habit, wealth, and the church. The papacy grew in prominence, gradually assuming roles once managed by secular authorities, mediating disputes, coordinating defense, and organizing charity. Regional rulers exercised practical power over territories, yet the city of Rome retained its symbolic significance, serving as a reference point for law, tradition, and culture. The coexistence of secular and religious authority shaped governance in a way that preserved continuity, even as political structures shifted. Across these regions, economic and social life persisted with adaptation. Agriculture remained the foundation of most communities, with estates and villages supplying food and resources to towns. Trade, while sometimes interrupted, continued along the Mediterranean, river valleys, and overland routes, linking distant regions. Coins circulated, although barter and localized exchange became more common, particularly in rural areas. Wealth and authority concentrated among landowners, military leaders, and church officials, whose management of resources provided stability in the absence of a central imperial administration. Culturally, Roman influence remained pervasive. Latin continued as the language of literacy, law, and the church, even as local dialects and languages evolved. Education, often preserved in monasteries, maintained knowledge of Roman texts, philosophy, and law. Architecture retained Roman forms. Basilicas, aqueducts, walls, and roads continued to shape towns and cities. Festivals, religious observances, and civic rituals preserved elements of Roman tradition, offering continuity even as governance transformed. The Church, more than any other institution, became the vessel through which Roman civilization persisted. Bishops, abbots, and clergy administered education, legal matters, and relief efforts. Monasteries preserved manuscripts, copied texts, and maintained knowledge across generations. Christianity provided a shared cultural and moral framework, helping communities remain cohesive even as political boundaries shifted and rulers changed. In many ways, the Church became the steward of Roman heritage, preserving the structures, ideals, and practices of a civilization whose political unity had dissolved. Military and political life continued to adapt to these realities. Armies were smaller, often regionally organized, and included a mix of local levies and former imperial soldiers. Fortifications remained crucial for defense, yet control of territories relied increasingly on negotiation, alliance, and the personal authority of local rulers. Conflicts occurred, but they were generally smaller in scale, addressing immediate threats rather than attempting to reconquer or unify the old empire. The legacy of Roman military organization persisted, providing training, tactics, and strategy that influenced both local and regional powers. Through all of these transformations, the memory of Rome endured, even as centralized authority disappeared. Its infrastructure, legal frameworks, cultural norms, and social institutions continued to shape the daily lives of millions. Citizens, rulers, and clergy alike inherited the practices of governance, the use of law, the architecture of towns, and the rituals of public and religious life. Rome, in essence, continued to exist, not as an empire, but as a civilization whose influence extended across centuries, guiding the development of emerging European societies. Life in these post-Roman territories was a balance between adaptation and continuity. Communities navigated new rulers and political realities while maintaining routines, habits, and institutions inherited from centuries of Roman administration. Roads connected towns, rivers carried trade, markets supplied necessities, and cities remained hubs of culture and governance. The empire had ceased to exist politically, yet its legacy endured in the structures, practices, and memory that shaped Europe for generations to come. In this way, the story of the Western Roman Empire extends far beyond its formal end. Its decline was gradual, its transformation measured, and its influence enduring. The empire's political structures faded, but its culture, law, and infrastructure persisted quietly, guiding life in ways both practical and symbolic. Rome as a civilization continued, not as a singular power, but as a framework for order, identity, and continuity, deeply woven into the fabric of the post-imperial world.